So this paper is called Scooped, Estimating Rewards for Priority in Science. It's with my co-author, Carolyn Stein, who is a graduate student at MIT with me before I graduated, and she'll be on the job market this year, so keep an eye out for her. And we have more papers coming out in this area, so we're excited to show those as well. I'm currently a postdoc at Northwestern, but I'll be starting at Brigham Young University next year. So let me start with a quote by Robert Merton, and many of you would be familiar with this author. So he's a sociologist from writing in the 1950s about the sociology of science, basically broadly how the incentives and recognition in science work. He says that, in short, property rights in science become whittled down to just this one: the recognition by others of the scientist's distinctive part in having brought the result into being. I've emphasized recognition because unlike a patent setting where there's an applied technology that can go to market, scientists are really working on fundamental ideas that may not be able to commercialize. And so we have sort of a different system of norms to encourage innovation in that setting. And that's what Carolyn and I are focusing on in this talk. So I'll return to this definition throughout. The priority in scientific discovery is the credit given to the individual who first makes a scientific discovery. And first is underlined because in a setting where multiple teams might be working on the same project, we tend to think that whoever publishes their idea first gets the outsized share of the credit. Okay, that's their priority credit because they were the first one to arrive to publish. And we think that the second team, we sometimes say they're scooped, they would get sort of overshadowed even though they may have put in the same amount of work. So we can think throughout history of historical examples of scientific races and even priority disputes. For example, Newton and Leibniz, Darwin and Wallace, that you're familiar with. Even recently, Perelman versus Yazoo and Cao over the proof of the Poincaré conjecture. Just one example of cases where two teams are sort of racing to be the first to publish, and then the community is sort of assessing who is going to get the most credit. Maybe they'll get the idea named after them or something like that, get a lot of citations. And so that sort of tension is somewhat fundamental to science. In our day-to-day life, even as researchers, we worry about getting scooped. You might open up Twitter one day and see someone else posting a working paper that looks a lot like they scooped you. And we sort of are worried that that might happen and we'll lose out on the credit we would otherwise get. So that's what we're going to be looking at. I mean, from a more economic perspective, these innovation races, the structure of races, and the distribution of rewards is very policy relevant. So we can think about the pace, the direction of science, even the quality of the science that we get. These races, of course, have some strategic implications for how scientists behave. And of course, if getting scooped has a big negative effect on your career, that risk might affect who enters into science from a labor market perspective. So all of these we think are very important, but we don't have very much empirical evidence about how these races are structured and how they play out. Even if we think about just the distribution of rewards, theoretical models often assume that the scoop papers get 0% of credit. They sort of have a winner-take-all tournament framework. We probably think that if you're scooped, you can still publish a paper, you can still get some citations. We surveyed a bunch of scientists that are in our data and had them guess actually the share of credits of citations they think the scoop paper would get, and they put it at about 26%. All right. But again, we just haven't seen very many papers who have tried to estimate this credibly in real scientific data. And that's what we're trying to contribute here. So we could pose our main research question as, what is the causal effect of getting scooped? We'll think about the short run effect on projects, whether it's published, what journal it places in, and how many citations. And we'll also think about the long run effects on careers. So, we think that if especially novices are scooped, that may sort of deter them from continuing with science or affect their ability to publish in the future. And we'll take a look at that as well. At the end of the talk, I'll take some time to discuss how the priority reward system might reinforce inequality in science. Or in other words, is the scoop effect equal for high and low reputation teams? And this is going to have to do with a Matthew effect and some other ideas about inequality that you may be familiar with from other work. So there's a key empirical challenge here, and that the reason we think that there hasn't been a lot of work in this area is the potential for selective abandonment of scooped projects. So if you consider, for example, going to just the publication data, the Web of Science or something, and finding papers that look very similar, and then comparing their outcomes based on which one came out first. That's a potentially very biased comparison. The reason is that once the first team has published their paper, if I'm scooped, I can then decide. I could either just push out my paper quickly and publish it as is, but I could change it a lot so it doesn't look very similar to the first paper, or I could just abandon it altogether. So those scoop papers that do appear in the publications are a very selected set, and we can't get an unbiased estimate of the causal effect of getting scooped. So we're going to try to roll back the curtain a little bit and look at an area where we have very detailed project level data that we can observe prior to publication. So we can try to reconstruct some of these races. And we'll do that in a setting called structural biology using the protein data bank. To preview what we find, priority papers get about 54% of the total citations between the two papers, and the scooped one gets 46%. So immediately you'll see that that's a much more even distribution of credit than the theory models certainly say, but also compared to the surveyed scientists, they're much more pessimistic about how many citations the second paper will get. And so we're going to say that that's a new finding, suggesting that actually the community is pretty good at assigning credit in these cases. On the other hand, there is still a noticeable effect of getting scooped. So those projects are less likely to be published. They're less likely to appear in a top journal, and that translates into a somewhat of a noticeable citation penalty. In the next 5 years, in terms of careers, scoop scientists, they end up having the same number of publications, but fewer citations. So we don't see that getting scooped is derailing people completely from their academic career, but there may be a bit of a Matthew effect on the number of citations that they get in the next few years. And lastly, the priority system does seem to reinforce inequality. What's really cool in our case is that we can find papers or races between a very high reputation team and a very low reputation team. And in those cases, the citation penalty is much larger for the low ranked or low reputation teams compared to their competitors. And there's more in the paper on this. We have a model of statistical discrimination to sort of justify our results. I won't spend time on that today, but we welcome you to open up the paper and read it. Briefly on the literature here, I mentioned that economists and sociologists have talked about how racing affects the pace, quality, and direction of science. In IO literature, there's a long set of papers on the strategic behavior of scientists. And then also, as I mentioned, you'll be familiar with this Matthew effect literature, where we think that that scientists has this cumulative success, where we sort of pay a lot of attention to the superstars who have been successful in the past. And we're going to, again, have a very nice setting to look at some of those dynamics. Okay. In terms of an agenda, I'm going to spend some time on background here because structural biology is the specific field we're looking at, and there's some features of the data that you won't be familiar with, so I'll look at that. And also be very careful to define what we mean by a race and what we mean by getting scooped. It sort of has a very specific definition. I'll talk about identification of this causal scoop effect because we're not in an RCT world. And so we'll look a little bit about potentials for selection bias and so forth. I'll show the results. And then in this last section, again, we'll talk about priority and inequality. So let me go back to this idea of the empirical challenges of estimating or reconstructing these races. So first, if you were to look for an ideal setting, you'd want a place that has well-defined problems and, quote, one right answer. So the challenge is that, in economics, for example, our projects tend to be very squishy around the edges. So you might find two papers that are very similar, maybe about the minimum wage, but there's some differences in their data or approach that makes it hard to say it's like they're sort of substitutes of each other. In fact, the second criteria we're looking for is a place where you have an objective measure of scientific proximity. So you can actually say how far two projects are in topic space from each other in a quantitative way. And then lastly, as I mentioned, it's helpful to have a view of potential abandonments prior to publication. And we're going to do that in this setting called structural biology. So these are scientists who are trying to determine the molecular structure of especially proteins as well as DNA and RNA. Proteins, they carry out, these important functions within our cells, and often we say that form determines function. So in order to understand what a protein is doing in our cells and how we might target it with a drug, for example, we need to know what its shape is. They're very tiny, so you can't use a microscope. They do these experiments called X-ray crystallography for the most part. And successful experiments, they basically grow their proteins into crystals, shoot them with X-rays, and they get this diffraction data set. And then the result that they're working towards is writing a model that matches that diffraction data that they've created. So that's sort of the output of these projects, is sort of taking a known protein and providing a model of its structure. That's the goal of this field. And it's quite important within biology. So there have been many Nobel Prizes in chemistry and medicine. It's important for certain diseases, Alzheimer's, et cetera. And also a lot of drug design requires knowledge of protein structures. Okay, and so we think it's very relevant and also has all the features that we're looking for. Returning to the key empirical challenges, we said we wanted well-defined problems. The structure discoveries are clear answers to concrete questions. And then in terms of proximity, there's actually a bioinformatics algorithm that we rely on to link projects with identical or at least very similar biological features. So we can actually say that these two projects deposited by different teams are 100% the same or 90%, et cetera. The PDB requires that projects are deposited prior to publication, allowing us to observe abandonments. So I'll talk much more about the protein data bank, but again, that's going to let us see a little bit of the pre-publication timeline that we need. So the PDB started in the 1970s, and it's a worldwide repository for the structural data of proteins. It includes a lot of metadata about the projects as well, and I'll show you an example in the next slide. Importantly, the major scientific journals, as well as organizations like the NIH, require scientists to submit their structured data to the PDB before publication. So you can't publish your big structural finding in science until you've uploaded all of those results into the PDB. And all of the authors do that confidentially, and they stay in secret for a few weeks or months until article publication. So this is an example. This is a timely example. This is the Cas9 protein. And this is Jennifer Doudna's lab. You'll recognize the scientist who just won a Nobel Prize in chemistry for her work on CRISPR. So they deposited this in 2014. In January, it was released to the public 1 month later. Importantly for us, they have linked the bibliographic data of the paper that sort of contains the results. So we'll use a PubMed identifier for this science paper to get outcomes that we're looking for. So we can get citations, journal placement, and so forth. And there's obviously lots of other data here. There's this sort of fundamental model they've deposited. This is all public to use. Any one of you can go and download this data and run your own regressions, which is really fun. So let me talk very carefully about what we mean by erase and how we define getting scooped. So this is kind of a standard project timeline. First, they would crystallize a protein and determine the structure. This is going on in the lab. And then, of course, they're writing and submitting and publishing a paper. So where does the PDB fit in here? The team typically deposits their findings into the PDB around the time that they're submitting a paper. So it's going to take some time for them to finish up the details, for the paper to be under review, and for it to come out. And remember that during that time, it's hidden from the public. There's actually no evidence even that someone has deposited until the release date. And importantly, the projects are coordinated, the PDB coordinates with the journals to release the data at the same time as the publication, at least within a couple of days. And so that's sort of what we're going to mark as the end of our races. And importantly, though, the asterisk there is that if projects go unpublished, the data is released publicly after 1 year. So if they decide to abandon, and in fact, 30% of the PDB projects are never published, it still enters our data after 1 year. And so, we can observe those abandonments and we'll take advantage of that as well. So just to give you a sense of the timeline, so they also report when they did their experiments. The lab work itself takes, a year or two or more. We're going to focus at the sort of end stage of this race. So on average, this is 6 months between deposit and release. As it can go as fast as maybe a month, but it's about the median is about 5 months. And so what we're going to do to construct scoops, I'll give you an example, is that we're going to find projects that are, again, biologically similar, that the algorithm links as being the same. So say project A and B, and we're going to observe their timelines. Whoever releases their data first, or again, related to their publication date, we're going to call the winner. And so the blue team here is the team that scooped. Importantly, though, we're going to require that both teams had deposited their data prior to either of them releasing. And so what we're looking for is cases where we have two teams who are working on the same project independently. They'd both deposited their data confidentially, and then we observe which one is released first. Okay, and so that's what we're going to call a race. We're going to exclude cases like this, where we see project A release, and then another team come in weeks or months later to deposit their finding and release. And the reason, again, is going back to this idea of selection bias. So once this date happens, then this team could have decided to just abandon their project and it never would have entered our data. And so that doesn't give us sort of these clean cases where both teams were at risk of winning their race. And that sort of helps clamp down on that selection bias. The other good thing is that it allows us to just compare teams where the only difference is the priority ordering. So we know that both teams independently completed the race and could have won. And all we're looking at is which one comes out first. So we've sort of isolated these late stage races so that we can just look at the effect of priority. Okay, so to summarize, we take 70,000 deposits released between 1999 and 2017. We look for pairs where the protein is biologically identical, the teams have no common authors, and both teams had completed the project independently before the first paper is released. And that gives us about 3,300 deposits in total, or 5% of the PDB. So let me just give you an example. This will hopefully crystallize things. These are the two models deposited by two separate teams for the PDX P450 CAM complex. And I'm not a biologist, but to my eye, the models here look very similar. And in fact, again, the algorithm says that they are. If you look at this UC Irvine team deposited in March of 2013, and their competitor came a month later in April. But most importantly, this deposit came before the release date of the first team in June. So again, both teams would have won the race. This one happened to get there first. This one came a month or two later. Now, the first paper came out in Science, a high impact journal. They got 52 citations. Now, the second team, they came out in a good field journal, Journal of Molecular Biology, but a much lower impact factor, and they did in fact get fewer citations. So our regression sample is basically 1,500 cases that look like this. In fact, in this case, the scooped team actually wrote in their paper that they had been scooped. They actually referenced the first team. That doesn't always happen depending on the timing, but we're confident that this is sort of capturing the types of scoops that we're looking for. And even though this one was published, again, many cases, they may have been abandoned. All right, so let's talk briefly about identification. The concern here is that the race winners, they're not randomly assigned, so it could be that they're sort of positively selected in a way that would bias our estimates. Looking at the data, it seems like the outcome of these races is very unpredictable. So the first thing we'll do is just visually check the balance. We're going to use some team level observables such as affiliation in a Lasso model, and then compare those predicted citations based on their attributes. The other thing we're going to do, and I won't spend much time on this, we use a method called post-double selection Lasso to select optimal control variables. What you're going to see, though, is that our results are very robust to any type of control selection method, and so that gives us some confidence in the credibility of the estimate. So just to show this, predicted citations, we're going to do a Lasso model where we take citations predicted by like the team size, author age, past productivity of the authors, affiliation, rank, and location. And each of this, I'm just going to plot actually each matchup in our data. So each dot is a winner and loser. Here we have the predicted citations of the losers, and this is the predicted citations of the winners. And you'll see that these dots up here, for example, are like a Harvard team who scooped a very low ranked team that wouldn't get very many citations usually. But we have a lot of cases where the opposite, where the low ranked teams are scooping the high ranked teams. So we're really looking for symmetry over the 45-degree line, and we can see that the distribution here is very even. If we do this as a histogram where we just take the difference between the winner and loser predicted citations, you see it's very sort of, that it's distributed around 0 and pretty symmetrical. We could compare that to a random priority ordering, where we just take the matchups that we observe and flip a coin to see who wins. And you see that it lines up very closely. If there is any advantage for the winner in predicted citations, it's by like 0.2 citations, which is like much smaller than the results we're going to find. So let's talk about estimation. Now everything is very simple. So now that we have all of that background and setup, the regressions are straightforward. So we just take our outcome, like citations Y, and regress it on a dummy for being scooped. We're going to include controls if we want, and then also a fixed effect for the protein or the race. So we're just sort of literally comparing the winner and loser within the same race. And the beta is then going to tell us kind of this penalty of getting scooped. I'll leave this for the paper if you'd like. The post double selection lasso method, it sort of picks controls that are very correlated with treatment assignment and the outcomes. But again, this will be our preferred specification, but even if we include no controls or many controls, we basically get the same answers. Okay, so here are our main results table. So first we'll look at whether it's published. So the effect on publication, you'll notice the winners actually publish 88% of the time. So there's sort of a latent abandonment risk for whatever reason. And we see that the scoop papers are more likely to abandon. Their publication probability goes down by 2.5 percentage points. I will say that that's much smaller than we predicted. You know, it's sort of discouraging to get scooped, but you know, in retrospect, these races are happening sort of right at the end stages where the project is already complete. They may have already even been preparing the paper, and so it's sort of a low cost to push it out to publication, even if you're going to fall to a lower journal. And indeed, we see that there's strong evidence that you know, your standard journal impact factor, standardized, goes down by about 0.2 standard deviations. In terms of placing in a top journal, the winners go to a top 10 journal 32% of the time, and the losers about 26% of the time. This translates to citations, as we said. We'll use this inverse hyperbolic sign transformation, basically like a log, fancy log plus 1. And so your citations go down by about 20%, and you're a little less likely to be in kind of the top 10% of hit papers for that year. Okay, so again, I mean, we're estimating negative effects very, very consistently. Again, to talk about identification, if you do this with no controls or sort of the full set of controls, you basically get the same answer across the board. So that gives us some confidence again in our estimates. So let me take a step back before showing some of the results to just talk about the magnitude. If we think about the citation penalty in terms of a share of citations, you can see that this is why we think it's pretty even actually. So the winner does get more citations, about 29 on average. The loser gets 24 on average. Or another way to say that is the winner gets 54% of the total citations. To take a little detour here, we sort of were thinking about whether we should think of this as large or small. We decided to do a survey to see what scientists would think. We actually just emailed all of the corresponding authors on PDB papers since 2014. And we posed this hypothetical scenario. We asked, suppose you just completed a very promising research project and you plan to submit it for publication this week. So we're sort of trying to put them at this late stage race. What's the probability of getting scooped at that stage? And then we asked, suppose you do get scooped and the other paper appears in Science, it gets 100 citations. What then is your probability of publishing? Where do you think it would publish, and how many citations would it get? So here we find that they're very pessimistic. So compared to those 100 citations of the winner, they think they'll only get 43 citations. And that's about, again, 30% of the winner, of the total. They're also very pessimistic about the probability of getting scooped. So they think it's much higher than the 8% that we see. They also think there's this very huge journal impact factor penalty. Basically, when you said, this winning paper comes out in Science, where do you think your paper will come out? They almost always say something like +1 or a very low field journal. Where in reality, we see a lot of cases where, if there are important projects, a journal like the PNAS or Journal of Molecular Biology will probably publish it, and that tends to have a higher impact factor than what they reported in the survey. So let me go back to some other results. We looked at some alternative measures of attention. You may be familiar with Altmetric. They look at like Mendeley downloads. There's a big sort of negative effect there. You're less likely to appear in a news story, get cited by Wikipedia. We don't see much of an effect on patents, although Matt Marks is going to discuss this. He might have some better patent metrics that we could be using. Even on Twitter, you might get a little less attention. So overall, we do think that besides just citation and journal placement, again, Science is a market for attention, and all these other sort of outlets are paying a little less attention to the winner. Again, much of this is probably driven by journal placement. We just pay much more attention to Science papers than we do to other ones. Okay, in terms of long-run consequences, here we're going to take basically the same regressions, but run them at the scientist level. So these are done by teams, typically including some veteran PI. There are going to be some grad students in there, postdocs. And so for each of those scientists, we're going to run this regression of outcomes on getting scooped. And the outcomes we're going to look at first is like the extensive margin of whether you're still active in PubMed or the PDB 5 years later. And then we'll look at your total publications and citations in the next 5 years. Okay, I'm going to show the results for everyone first and then separate it for novices and veterans based on your publication history. So I'm sorry that the text here is small. I guess one good thing about the Zoom seminar is you don't have to squint as much at the overhead projector. You can zoom in here, but what we show is that there's very small effect, not significant, on being active in PubMed 5 years later. So we don't see an effect that like people are abandoning Science altogether when they get scooped. We also show that there is a little bit of a negative effect and significant for being active in the PDB. So if there is discouragement, it might shift people away from structural biology, maybe towards other types of science, but we don't see a big effect overall. Indeed, on the intensive margin, if you just look at the PubMed PDB site publications, they tend to have no significant effects. Now, when we move to citations, though, we do see a negative penalty. So you lose about 17% of citations to your future work after being scooped. And so, that's significant. Going back to this idea of the Matthew effect, even if you're still publishing, it could just be that first place team tends to get more of the attention. If we break this down into novices and veterans, we see, very similar, effects across the board, but we'll see that the novices have maybe a larger effect, both on their probability of being active in the PDB and also on the citation. You see, they have about a 32% decrease in citations compared to the veterans who have a much smaller citation effect. That, of course, does match our ideas about the Matthew effect. And so that's, if there is cause for concern for the young folks in the room, might be on citations, but again, it's not like we're seeing people just driven out of Science altogether. Okay, so related to that, we can talk about this idea of inequality. So going back to Merton, he sort of proposes two key drivers of academic attention. He talked a lot about priority, and then he also posed these ideas of the Matthew effect. What's interesting here is we can sort of pit those against each other. What we really like about our setting is we see these cases where we have two teams potentially from very different parts of the world, very different types of universities, who are working on literally the same project. Okay, they're trying to solve the exact same protein according, to these the bioinformatics data we have, and so that allows us to then see, whether the high-ranked team or the low-ranked team won the race. It might change the distribution of attention. Now we sort of think of that about that as statistical discrimination. This idea that people who are citing the papers are relying on signals of past productivity to decide, who might have the better paper and who they should cite. But you can imagine other stories like a network story. Maybe the high-ranked teams are connected to better editors. There's potentially different explanations, but let's look at the empirical results and then discuss a bit of what we find. So first, what we want to do is it's actually pretty simple. I'm just going to define reputation based on the predicted citations I showed you earlier. So this is from the Lasso model of predicted citations. And what I'm going to do is take all of these matchups that we observe and just divide them into 4 quadrants. So a bit split at the median of predicted citations. So when you have 2 above median teams racing each other, they're up in this quadrant. Okay, this is like the Harvard and MIT teams pitting it out. But we also have many instances of low-ranked teams racing each other. What we're going to find interesting is the ones on the off axis here, where here the high-ranked team scooped the low-ranked team, but alternatively, we have many cases where the low-ranked team scooped the high-ranked team. And I'm just going to split those up and show our distribution of citations separately for each kind of race that we observe. So let's start with the evenly matched races. So if we look at the cases where the high scoops the high, the winner share is about 55%. So that's very, similar to the average effect that I've been showing you. In the low scoops low case, it's actually just about the same fraction, so 55%. You'll notice that the level of citations has changed. That could either be because these high reputation teams just get a lot of attention. Could also be about project selection. So they're, these are potentially racing on much more important projects. And so that's why we see a difference there. But again, the distribution of rewards is very similar in those 2 types of races. This is the interesting one. When the high ranked team scoops the low ranked team, they get about 66% of the citations. I guess that's a much higher share. And in the converse, when the low ranked team wins the race, they get about 46% of the citations. So imagine if you were sort of plugging away at a lesser known university on sort of this big project, you get it out into the world, but then a team from Harvard comes in a couple days later or months later to publish, they're going to end up getting more citations than you on average, even though you were first. And so that's why we say that there's these sort of counterbalancing effects. One is we're rewarding people for priority, but there's also this reputation effect that in some cases even dominates the priority effect. And so we think that's relevant. I mean, there's a lot of policy discussion about inequality in science. And so we're providing some evidence of that. Thinking more about the welfare concerns is sort of more involved in the scope of this paper, but we think that this is important evidence to show. Okay, so to conclude, getting scooped does lower the citations that you get, but the rewards tend to be much more evenly distributed than we previously thought. We want to sort of assuage people's concerns who think that once you get scooped, your career is over. But we see that they're somewhat even. I will make a sort of a side note here. As I discussed earlier, we're really focusing on races that are right at the end stage. So these results don't tell us very much about what happens when you get scooped maybe earlier in the project. So sometimes we feel really bummed when you just come up with an idea and you get the ball rolling and someone publishes it. You can feel like you're getting scooped, but that's different than what we're looking at here. We're really, again, isolating just the priority effect. These are 2 teams who had independently completed the project. We know that they would have published if they could, but that first team is the one that gets the priority benefit. Okay, so what we think is really interesting after having written this paper is that there's a lot of normative implications about these races. So is the premium for priority too large or too small from a social planner's perspective? And Carolyn and I are actually, her paper that's going to be coming out in a few weeks is really going to dive into this welfare consideration. So let's think about a little bit about, what we might consider. The priority on one hand could be good for the world because it could incentivize effort and timely disclosure. Remember, we want scientists to have a bit of pressure to work quickly and to get their results out in the world. We really want them to publish and try to be first in these races. On the other hand, if they're focusing so much on racing, that could incentivize speed at the expense of important metrics like quality and transparency. So this tends to be a very secretive field, for example, and many of the lab sciences are this way. People don't present their results in conferences until publication, et cetera. And so there's concerns about how the racing dynamic affects transparency. Carolyn and I in our next paper are really going to be focusing on the quality margin, where if you're so worried about getting your paper out, you might cut corners on important metric, doing important metrics of quality and how correct your results are, how reproducible they are, and so forth. And that's a potential concern. If we're racing too much, we could end up in an equilibrium where all of the science is less reliable than we would have hoped. And so that's sort of what's coming up next. This is hopefully there's more to this agenda, and we encourage other people to participate in it as well. I'm looking forward to hear the discussion from Matt, and again, thank you all for listening.